Welcome, nature detectives. I'm Conrad Baker. I'm an outdoor educator with the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation at Letchworth State Park, and today I have a nature mystery for you. I found what looks like a really skinny tree reaching way up high into the ceiling of the forest. I think we can use our nature tools to figure out what kind of plant this is and how it helps us every single day. We use two nature tools to do that: our eyes and our fingers. First thing I noticed about this plant is that it's climbing and winding up way up high into some trees. That tells us that this is probably some kind of vine. First thought that a lot of folks have when they think vines is poison ivy. But looking carefully at this vine, do you notice how it's hanging away from this tree right here? This is the closest tree to it, though the tree that it one day probably used to climb up to where it is now. But you see how it's not touching it today? There's no stringy strings or like little fingers or like little grabby arms attaching this tree to this plant right here. That tells us that this is not poison ivy. Poison ivy likes to have fuzzy, hairy, little fingery things called tendrils reaching up and grabbing onto objects and holding them fast onto it and then climbing up that way. This kind of plant likes to hang away from solid structures. Great nature clue, and it's why I'm so confident touching it without getting a rash. Second nature clue is, now that we have our hands on this thing, let's feel its bark. It has bark kind of like a tree, and boy, I feel it. It has all these long strands hanging off. It's like it's all peeling away, almost like it's sick or has some kind of disease. But it doesn't have any kind of disease. That's how this kind of plant likes to have its skin. It just naturally has a kind of a peely, flaky skin, flaky bark that tends to dangle off in big pieces or sometimes just kind of bunch up into tight little groups of stringy, strandy bark. A third nature clue, you can look way up over my head. Do you notice how it's only holding on at the very, very tips of where it's growing? It's only holding on by its little tiny fingers way up above onto that tree. The whole rest of the structure of this plant is dangling away out in the open air. It seems like it would be a great thing to climb or to swing on. Let's put all those nature clues together. We have a plant that's hanging from a tree but way out into the middle of the air. This plant has these dangly, hanging pieces of bark, and it doesn't have any tiny little hairy, reachy, grabby guys trying to hold itself onto anything close to the ground. This must be a wild grapevine. Now, wild grapevines, while they look like they'd be great to climb on and swing, I would caution you from personal experience of mine that it doesn't always work out. Sometimes because they're only holding on by the very tips of where they're growing, these wild grapevines tend to snap off very easily. So it might not be as much fun as it looks at first. However, wild grapes are very helpful to us humans. After all, they are a kind of grape. The grapes aren't very delicious. They're kind of small and sour and have lots of seeds, but hey, you could eat them if you wanted to. You won't see the grapes this time of year. They're already done. You also won't see the leaves on these vines. The leaves look vaguely like a maple leaf, and they're kind of open and wide like a palm, and they're probably mixed in with the leaves down at my feet here. But they tend to be very thin, and they tend to deteriorate and rot away very quickly. The bark of these plants, these wild grapevines, being so peely, is very useful to some kinds of birds. As they're making their nests, the birds will peel away little bits of the grape's bark and use this as part of their nest. They'll use it to cover the outside, maybe for some camouflage, and some birds will even use it to line the inside as a little cushion for their eggs and their babies. Very useful plant to have around, and also happens to be super common. Wild grape grows really well in western New York and across New York State. So I bet if you really want to put your nature detective skills to the test, you could find some wild grape in your neighborhood. Look not only in the woods, but also around old buildings. The grapevine doesn't care if it's growing on a tree or on an old building. After all, sometimes you'll see them climbing up the sides of buildings, but make sure that you use those nature clues looking for a vine that's hanging away from the main structure. Any vine that has little hanging little grabby fingers clutching closely to a building or a tree is going to be something else, not this wild grapevine. Well, thank you so much for joining me for today's Nature Mystery. If you have any questions about grapevines or other kinds of vines that grow in New York State, please put a comment in the comment section below the video. Share this video with your friends to put their nature detective skills to the test. And as always, like Letchworth State Park's Facebook page to stay tuned for more nature mysteries.